All right, in the last video we talked about the difference between the identity and the inverse properties. This video we're going to look at the last two properties we're going to be talking about today. So the first one is going to be the distributive property. Okay, with the distributive property, we are giving the number next to parentheses to all parts inside the parentheses. Okay, so if I have a number next to parentheses and then two numbers inside parentheses, b plus c, I'm going to do this a times both of those numbers. So a times b and a times c, and then it will be separated by whatever operation was between b and c. So here is addition, so I will separate those with addition. You can also do this what they call a cross subtraction. So it's literally the same, but it's b minus c in parentheses. I'm still doing a times the parentheses, so that's a times b and a times c, with this time the subtraction in between. Okay, so typically you're only going to do this when you have examples that have both numbers and variables. So if you're given something like 3 times x minus 2, that would be the same thing as 3 times x, which is just 3x, and then 3 times 2, which is 6, and then I bring the minus in between. Okay, so 3 times x minus 2 is the same thing as 3x minus 6. We could also see something like just a negative sign next to parentheses and 2x plus 1. That negative means that I could distribute that negative as a -1 to all of the numbers inside the parentheses. So I could take this part and I look at this -1 right here. I put a 1 where the negative sign is next to the parentheses so that I can see that it actually means 1. We know this because anything times 1 is itself, and then I would take that -1 and distribute it to the parts inside. So I would have -1 times 2x, so -1 times 2 in my calculator is -2, and then I keep the x, and then -1 times 1 in my calculator is -1, so I would add a -1. The only thing that we need to know that we'll talk about when we solve equations is that this guy right here can be simplified a little bit further, and we'll talk about that in our next unit when we go to solve equations. We'll look at one more example. If I had something like -2 times 5a minus 1. So I would take that -2 that's next to parentheses and I distribute or give it to both numbers inside. When I do that, I do -2 times 5a, so -2 times 5 in my calculator is -10a. And then I do -2 times 1 in my calculator is -2, but then I need to bring this minus sign over here. Again, same thing, we won't talk about it today, but we need to make a note that this can be simplified further. And we'll talk about that when we go to solve equations. Last property we're going to talk about is the multiplicative property of 0. It's going to be hopefully the easiest one that you see. Multiplicative property of 0. So we won't even take a wordy definition like we've done in all the others. we're just going to use variables. Any number A times 0 is equal to 0. So 2/5 times 0 is equal to 0. Negative 11 times 0 is equal to 0. 0 is equal to pi times 0. All of those are examples of the multiplicative property of 0.